Hello guys, welcome back to this channel Learn for Tech, and today we are on Private VLAN or PVLAN on Cisco Catalyst Switch. So our first step is to know what is Private VLAN, and a Private VLAN is a networking concept that enhances the security segmentation of a local area network LAN. In a traditional VLAN or virtual local area network, devices within the same VLAN can communicate with each other freely. However, a PVLAN takes this segmentation further by subdividing a VLAN into sub-VLAN with restricted communication capabilities. In PVLAN setup, we have three main types of ports. We have one promiscuous port. This port, also known as a primary VLAN. These are ports that can communicate with other ports within the VLAN or the private VLAN, including the isolated and community ports. Typically, a router or a gateway device is connected to a promiscuous port. Like as we can see here, we have a server. So this port can communicate with all these ports. And let's go now to community port to see what the capability of the community port. So community ports, devices connected to the community port can communicate with each other and with promiscuous ports, but not with devices on isolated port. This allows certain devices to share information while being isolated from the rest of a VLAN. So community ports can communicate with promiscuous port and also with each other, but cannot communicate with isolated ports. And also another port, we have isolated port. Devices connected to isolated ports can communicate only with the promiscuous ports, but not with each other or other isolated ports. This helps the isolating individual devices from one another for enhanced security. As you can see here, E03 and E02, they cannot communicate each other, but they can communicate with promiscuous port. They cannot also communicate with community ports. So the main difference with community ports and isolated ports is that community can communicate with each other and with promiscuous ports, but for isolated cannot communicate with each other, neither not communicate with community port, but they can communicate with promiscuous. That's how the setup of a private VLAN is. So the private VLAN always has one primary VLAN or as one primary VLAN. Within the same primary VLAN, you will find this port. In my picture, this topology, we can see a server connected to a promiscuous port, and all other ports can communicate with it, as we have just stated. The names of these secondary VLANs are well chosen, if you ask me. For example, in a community, everyone can talk to each other in real life. In a community that everyone can communicate with each other. When you are isolated, you can only talk to yourself or in case of our private VLAN, the promiscuous port. So in this community, it's like real life. When you're in a community, you can communicate with each other. But when you're isolated, means you can communicate with yourself. But because of our topology or because of the network setup, but you can also communicate with promiscuous port. So, and this is our setup. And this setup, let me sum up what we have. We have a primary VLAN that has a number of a primary VLAN. We have a number of 500. And also the secondary community VLAN has a number of 510. For the community, we have 510. And also the secondary isolated VLAN has a number of 520. So these are VLAN numbers. I just made up these VLAN numbers. You can use whatever you like, but for me, I've used 500, 510, and 520. PC1 and PC2 in community VLAN should be able to reach each other and also to the server connected to promiscuous port. 3 and 4 in isolated VLAN can only communicate with the server on the promiscuous port. The server should be able to reach all the ports. So this is our setup. Let's now start our configuration. We have this is our switch. And before we do the configuration, we don't have any configuration so far. But let me try to ping from PC1. Let me ping PC2. Let me check if I have okay, we don't have IP addresses. So from PC1, IP 192.168.1.1. Can save. PC2, IP address 192.168.1.2. Save. PC3 192.168.1.3. Yes. Save. And we have PC4 IP 192.168.1.4. Okay, that's how we add IP addresses to our PCs. We have 192.168.1.1, 192.168.1.2 for PC2, and for PC3.3 for PC4. Let me try to ping 192.168.1.2. As you can see, it can ping because we don't have any configuration so far. We can try ping. We don't have any configuration so far. We can ping also PC3. We can also ping PC4. We don't have any configuration so far. We can also ping server because we don't have any configuration so far. They can reach each other. Okay, for server, okay, let me IP 192.168.1.10. So let me try ping server. As you can see, because we don't have any configuration, they can reach each other. So we have to configure now the private VLAN and observe what will happen. Okay, let's get started with our configuration. This is our switch. Let's go to the global configuration mode. Now, configuring private VLANs require us to change the VT mode to transparent. So VTP mode transparent. Okay. Now let me start configuration. For community VLAN, we have a VLAN number of 110 and primary 500, and isolated is 20. Let me maximize it for us or for you guys to see. Okay, we start with VLAN. Let me do the configuration and then explain it. VLAN 510, private VLAN community, VLAN 500, private VLAN primary, private VLAN associate, add 510. So set the community VLAN, we begin with creating VLAN 500 and assigning it as a community VLAN with a private VLAN community command. Then we create VLAN 500 and designate it as a primary VLAN with using the private VLAN primary. This command, we make this VLAN 500 as a primary. Finally, we inform the switch that VLAN 110, this VLAN 110 is secondary VLAN by applying the private VLAN associate add 110 command. We inform the switch that the VLAN 110 is a secondary VLAN. That's our first configuration. Now, let's go to the second configuration. Interface range E0/0, PC1 and PC2, switch port mode, private VLAN, host, switch port, private VLAN, host associate. We have 500 and 510. It's up. So interface 0/E0/0 and interface E0/1 are connected to PC1 and PC2 and belong to the community VLAN. As you can see here, we have a community VLAN. PC1 and PC2 is E00 and E01. On the interface level, I need to tell the switch that these are the host ports by using the switch port mode private VLAN host command. I also have to use the switch private VLAN host associate command to tell the switch that VLAN 500 is the primary VLAN and 510 is the secondary VLAN that are associated with these ports. So let's go to third configuration. And this is the third configuration. It's up. This is how now we configure a promiscuous port. As you can see that this is our port E1/1, a promiscuous port. Configure promiscuous port we configure promiscuous port by typing switch port mode private VLAN promiscuous. That's why we have assigned this port or identified this port E1/1 as promiscuous port. I also have to map the VLANs by using the switch port VLAN mapping command. So I'm mapping the primary VLAN 500 and the secondary community 510. Now we have done with the configuration of a community VLAN and mapping it with a promiscuous port. And we can do the verification. We can do the show interface. We can do the show interface E0/1 switch port. E0/1 switch port is this port PC2. You can do it to PC1 also. So we can verify our configuration by looking at the switch port information. E01 E00 and E01 have the same output. As you can see here now that a private VLAN host association, we have 500 as a primary and 510 as the secondary community. We can also check our promiscuous port, show interface E1 switch port, our promiscuous port of our, you can see the mapping information. We have the mapping information here that we have mapped the primary with the secondary community. So we are good to go. We can also do the show VLAN, private VLAN. This the show VLAN private VLAN command gives us the valuable information. You can see the VLAN 500 is the primary, as you can see here. 500 is the primary, and 510 is the secondary VLAN. It also tells us whether the VLAN is community or isolated. The type is community. So this is a very valuable information we have. We can also do show VLAN private type. I also like the show VLAN private type command because it gives us the quick overview of a private VLAN. And here for the primary, we can see the secondary, the community also we can see. We can also try to ping from PC1 before, when we have not done any configuration. They can ping each other. You can ping any computer, you can ping the server. But now let me try from PC1. Let me try to ping PC2. It can communicate. We can see PC1 can reach PC2. Let me try to ping the server. Yes, it can reach the server. Okay, the server can reach. Let us try to ping the server. From the server to ping PC2 192.168.1.2. So the server can reach PC2. That's very great. Our community VLAN seems to be up and running. We can also test from PC1. Let's ping 192.168.1.3 to see if we can ping isolated. Okay, it should not ping. Yes, that's correct. Now let's move. Let's now configure for the secondary isolated VLANs and see what will happen after this. Now for the isolated, we have, as you can see here, we have isolated number as 520. So let's start configuring secondary isolated VLAN. VLAN 520 private VLAN isolated VLAN 500 private VLAN primary private VLAN associate add 520. So the setup is identical to the community VLAN, but now I'm using the private VLAN isolated command. Remember to establish the connection between the primary and the secondary VLANs with the private VLAN associate add, like this one. The private VLAN primary command is no longer needed here because I have already configured it earlier, but I'm just showing it to keep the configuration complete. Now let's assign the interfaces now. Interface range is 0, 2, 3. Let's check. E0, 2, and 3 are on the isolated ports. That's why we want to assign them to the isolated configuration. So switch port mode private VLAN host. Switch port private VLAN host associate 500 and 520. Okay, this part is exactly the same as the configuration for the community VLAN, but I'm configuring interfaces for FA0 2 and FA0 3, which are connected to the PC3 and PC4. Now exit interface E1/1 switch port mode private VLAN promiscuous switch port private VLAN mapping. We map primary and the isolated. Okay, I already configured E1/1 as a promiscuous port, but I'm showing it here as well. To keep the configuration complete, I need to create an additional mapping between VLAN 500 primary and VLAN 520 as a secondary. That's why I've just repeated these configurations because of this mapping. Now we are done with the configuration with configuring isolated secondary. So let's verify our configuration. We'll show interface E0 3 switch port. E0 3 is PC4. We can also do for PC3, for PC2 with the same output. As you can see here, it's looking good. We can see the host association between 500 and 520. So we are good to go. We can also do the show command. Show interface E1/1 switch port. We can now see the VLAN 510 and VLAN 520 are mapped to the primary VLAN 500. Before for the community VLAN, because we had not configured isolated, we only saw 500 and 10. But now we have isolated VLAN. Now we can see the VLAN 510 and VLAN 520 are mapped to the primary VLAN 500. So we are good to go. Show VLAN, private VLAN. Now, here is a nice clean overview now that shows us all the VLANs, the mapping, and the interfaces. Now we can see the primary, we can see the secondary. We have the secondary for 510 and 520. The type for the 510 is community, and 520 is isolated. And these are the ports for the community, isolated, and the primary. So that's how we verify our configuration. Let's do another verification. Show VLAN private type. If you can, as you can see now, we have now all the three VLAN types. We have the primary 500, we have the community 510, and we have 520 isolated. Now let's try to ping to see if this configuration can achieve our desired results. Now from PC3, let me try to ping the server 192.168.1.10. I can ping the server. From PC4, let me try to ping the server. Yes. PC4 can also reach the server because the server has promiscuous port. Now, from PC3, let me try to ping PC4. Yes, we cannot from PC3 we cannot ping PC4 because of the secondary isolated VLAN. These ports can only see promiscuous ports, but cannot ping each other. But for the community, they can ping each other and also ping promiscuous ports. But also they cannot ping the isolated ports. That's how we configure the private VLAN. There's no reachability between PC3 and PC4 because they are isolated VLANs. This is a very useful setup for the security of our devices, and also if you have guest network, you can make use of the private VLAN technique to achieve what you want. Thank you guys. Welcome back to this channel.